Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Paul Rahmat from FIFAT International. I am pleased to welcome all of you, distinguished speakers and participants in this side event. Thank you for joining us. We are happy to know that already 112 participants have registered to this event. This side event highlights the theme Education, Extractives and Climate Change Nexus, Indigenous peoples as agents of peace in the context of Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia and the Philippines. We will discuss about the nexus of indigenous peoples' education, climate adaptation, and unsustainable land use, and conversion to monoculture palm oil farming on indigenous lands. Indigenous peoples of Indonesia and the Philippines will share their situation, analysis, and present actions. How do this contribute or not contribute to the realization of Sustainable Development Goals number 16? I would like to welcome especially our keynote speaker, Mrs. Victoria Tauli Corpus, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. Welcome, Mr. Vicky. Thank you for being with us. I welcome to our distinguished panelists, Ms. Olvi Tumbelaka from East Kalimantan Province, Indonesia, Mrs. Maria Lori Victor from the Northern Cordillera region of the Philippines, and Mr. Jason Nenaling from the Northern Mindanao of the Philippines. Thank you for your willingness to share about your experiences from the grassroots and your knowledge of the situations of the indigenous communities where you belong and are working. This event is organized by Maryknoll Sisters of St. Dominic and Vivat International. Both are members of the NGO Mining Working Group on Southeast Asia Subcommittee based in New York. I would like to acknowledge our partners and collaborators from the Philippines, Eco-Jesuit, and the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education, TEBA. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this side event, Helen Gangalen Magata, the Communications Officer of TEBA. She is an indigenous Kada clan from Paracelis Mountain Province, Philippines. Helen has dedicated the last 10 years working in the field of research, education, and communication, specifically on indigenous people's rights, climate change, community development, and climate finance. She holds a master's degree in development communication from the University of the Philippines. She also serves as the coordinator of the Green Climate Fund's Indigenous Peoples Global Advocacy Team. Welcome, Helen. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that very good introduction and for giving us a brief about this side event. So, as Paul has introduced me, I am working with the TEBA Foundation, the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education, and I'm happy to be moderating this session for today. So, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on which part of the world you are from. So welcome to our side event, Indigenous Peoples as Agents of Peace, Education, Extractives, and Climate Change Nexus. So before we start, if you have not done so yet, please take time to type in your name, your organization, and the country you are from in the chat box, as we won't have time to introduce each one of us in the event. So please take note that we are also leaving the chat box open throughout the session for all questions and or comments you may have in the panels. If you have specific questions that you would want or you want to request particular speakers to answer, kindly indicate them in the chat box as well. We are very fortunate to have um, 4 distinguished partners, colleagues and friends from the government, the civil society and indigenous peoples organizations and communities who will walk us through the connection, the nexus of climate change, of education, and of extractive industries as they relate to peace formation in the context of indigenous peoples. I will introduce our speakers one by one as they speak. So, dear speakers, you will have around 10 to 12 minutes each for your presentation. No more than that, I'm sorry. So my apologies in advance if I have to prompt you to wrap up should you go over time. This is the part where being the moderator is not my favorite role. So we then encourage our dear participants to type in their questions in the chat box so that we can collate for our panel speakers to respond after all of the speakers have spoken. Alternately, we also encourage speakers to respond in the chat box, especially for clarificatory questions that do not necessarily need a discussion, so that we minimize our time for back and forth. So after all the speakers have spoken, we will open the floor for questions and answer. We also hope to have more time at the end of all the speakers to collect other insights from our audience. So we have 1.5 hours for the entire event, and we hope to make it a worthwhile learning session for everyone. So I can see that at least 18 participants have already chatted introduced themselves. So thank you so much for those who are just coming in. Please type in your names and organizations and also the countries you're coming from. And then afterwards, when our speakers start their intervention, feel free to type in your comments and questions as well. So to start off, our keynote speaker to set the scene for this session is Ms. Victoria Tolley Corpus. So she's the 3rd United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples from 2014 to 2020. So she's a human rights expert focusing mainly on Indigenous peoples' rights and women's rights, as well as the right to development and a safe and sustainable environment. So she's a leader of various Indigenous peoples and women's organizations at the national, regional, and global levels. And as a community organizer and institution and movement builder, she helped establish and strengthen local Indigenous peoples organizations, as well as regional and global Indigenous formations. Some of these Indigenous organizations include, but not limited to, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, the Asian Indigenous Women's Network, Global Partnership of Indigenous Peoples on Climate Change, Forests, and Sustainable Development, and the Global Network on Extractive Industries and Indigenous Peoples, among many others. So her work for almost 4 decades up to the present is to raise awareness on Indigenous peoples' rights and train and help build capacities of Indigenous peoples to assert and claim their rights. She has consistently participated in drafting and negotiating the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 1985 until its adoption in 2007. So from 2005 to 2009, she became the chairperson of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous Issues, or the PFII. She is also the founder and executive director of Tubtuba, where I work. That makes her my boss. And she is actively engaging, very much actively engaged in various global, regional, national arenas to advocate for Indigenous people's rights and development, and thus research as well as training on Indigenous people. So without further ado, I now turn over the floor to you, Vicky. Over.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you to Marinol Sisters and Vivat International for organizing this side event. Indeed, the issues that you have put into this event are the crucial issues that need to be dealt with if we want to achieve Goal 16, no, which is strengthening institutions and bringing about peace and justice. For indigenous peoples, they do have their own institutions, no? These institutions of governance, institutions of justice, as well as education institutions where they transmit their knowledge systems to the younger generations. And these have been existing, even of course before colonization, but a lot of these have been undermined when colonization and nation state building took place, no? And so we are now in a situation where a lot of indigenous peoples do not have that much control over their territories, and the right to self-determination, which is the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. These rights are one of the rights that are most commonly violated. So if we talk of institutions, we start from one of the foundational articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which affirms that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, and they have the right to set up their governance systems, whether this comes in the form of autonomy, no? And as a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, I have gone through many countries, and in Latin America in particular, I've seen how strong some of their indigenous governance institutions are, and their justice systems, that their main demand is to really ensure that the states recognize these systems and gives support for them to strengthen their institutions. Now, of course, for as long as indigenous peoples are in control over their territories, the right to pursue their own economic and social and cultural development also will be guaranteed, so we cannot talk of the right to self-determination and right to autonomy if we don't talk about the need to respect and protect the rights of indigenous peoples to their territories and to their resources. So that's the link that we see now. And now when we look at the situation of indigenous peoples in many parts of the world, the violation of their right to have control and manage their own territories and resources is happening in a massive scale, no? And this is one of the key reasons why deforestation has taken place in their communities. And in fact, many of them have even been displaced from their own territories to be placed in territories that are not their own ancestral domains or their own traditional territories. And therefore, even the knowledge system that comes along, the culture, the rituals that are very much linked to living in this land, the identity, that they have, which is also linked to their lands, these are all undermined. So when we talk now of Paul mentioned earlier about oil palm plantations and extractive industries, and the title of the event also includes extractive industries, as well as large-scale infrastructure development in indigenous territories. These are the developments that they have seen, since colonization up to the present, and which has really destroyed some of their territories as well as their cultures, their identities, and their rights, and their right to govern themselves. So in this event, we will be hearing some stories on how indigenous peoples have struggled to ensure that they are able to still protect their lands, because they believe that that is their responsibility, not only to their own future generations, but to the world in general. When they want to preserve their lands, it's not just for themselves, but it's also for the rest of society. And we have seen a lot of researches now which will show that the highest levels of biodiversity are found in indigenous peoples' territories, even if they are just 5% of the world's population, and they only occupy almost 20% of the world's territories, no? So the highest biodiversity, 80%, are found in our territories, and that is a testament to the fact that we indeed have contributed in solving many of these problems. And if states and other actors are going to support further our knowledge, our traditional systems of managing our resources, then there will be a bigger chance for us to be able to survive this crisis, various crises that we meet today, whether this is the climate change crisis, the biodiversity erosion, or even the COVID-19. No, as we are all going through this now, basically COVID-19 is really a situation which has been brought about because of our disrespect for nature and our disrespect, no, for also the wildlife in our own territories. So I think that this is all these are all very much related. And what I have also seen, and this brings me to the whole issue of education or knowledge, what I have also seen is that many indigenous people still continue to practice their traditional resource management systems, no? Here in the Cordillera, where we come from, Lori and even Helen also are from here, we do have our own forest management systems, like us in Mountain Province, we have the Batangan, where we protect our forests, and whoever is found to destroy the forest, they are penalized by the communities, and the communities are mobilized in their numbers whenever there are forest fires and all that. No, I was in Timor-Leste last year when one of the last few countries I went to, and they have a system called Tarabandu, no, where they manage also their territories, their oceans, as well as their forests, and it's the responsibility of each of these people in the members of the indigenous peoples in Timor-Leste to implement this. And they have shown to me some of the forests and even the oceans, no, parts of the oceans which they have kept intact because they are guarding this. They are assigned, they have their own assignments to ensure that these ocean resources are also protected and managed well. No, so I think that's those are mainly the points I would like to stress. And maybe and so the education system really needs to recognize these indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous traditional resource management practices, so that this will be some of the things that can be taught in the schools and not just left to our elders. And of course, as indigenous peoples of the present generations, it's also our task to understand what these systems are and to ensure that they are being practiced continuously. No, so the issue of transmission of knowledge is really something that the education system also needs to address. And I'm very glad to see Lori here, because in the Philippines, they have developed, she is in charge of the indigenous people's education of the Department of Education here in the Philippines. And she can share with us what they are doing to ensure that these knowledge systems are made known better by young people, and also the governance systems, you know, these indigenous governance systems and justice systems as well. The issue of peace and security is very much related to access to justice, no, by indigenous peoples. If there are conflicts of interest, there are conflicts, whether violent or not. Uh, Access to justice is a key issue, that key element that they need to have. And I've seen in many of my visits as well that there are many indigenous peoples, even indigenous authorities, who are put in prison. They are because they are accused as so-called terrorists, or they are not following the dominant systems that exist. And we know very well that the dominant many of the dominant government systems are very are blind to indigenous systems, and that is the challenge that we face as we talk about peace and justice and strong institutions. If we strengthen the institutions of indigenous peoples, whether these are traditional or not, we strengthen strengthen indigenous organizations and their capacities to raise awareness amongst themselves and empower themselves, then our contribution to sustainable development will be heightened. And in particular, the achievement of SDG 16 will also be there. So it's a big challenge. There are still a lot of issues that we need to deal with, but hopefully with us here in this panel discussing this issue and the sessions of the Permanent Forum, they will come up with recommendations that indeed will affirm the contributions of indigenous peoples, both to climate change mitigation and adaptation, to biodiversity conservation, as well as to the sustainable use of the resources that we have, and to look into how the education system can be reformed so it will be able to integrate these kinds of knowledge that are made invisible because of racism and discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for setting the scene for our session for today. So Vicky has posed some crucial elements for discussion on indigenous people's self-determination and how this is so much interconnected to their lands, territories, and resources. And rightly so, because there's no way of starting discussions about other elements of indigenous people's lives, such as, for example, education, extractive industries, and even impacts of climate change without starting off from the cosmovision of indigenous peoples, that everything is interrelated. So our second speaker is Ms. Maria Lurie Victor, who will be discussing and sharing what they're doing on strengthening and upholding indigenous people's education. And Vicky has sort of prepared the stage for the first panel by saying that yes, if we strengthen indigenous peoples and empower indigenous peoples communities, then their contribution to biodiversity and climate action such as adaptation and mitigation, and also to the achievement of SDGs is heightened. So Maria Lurie Victor is going to share the national advocacy of indigenous peoples communities in supporting organization as critical contributor to institutionalization of the indigenous peoples education in the Philippines. So Lurie hails from the Northern Cordillera region of the Philippines. That's where Vicky and myself are coming from as well, and belongs to the Kankanaay indigenous cultural community of Benguet province. Her involvement in the indigenous people's advocacy in the Philippines has been in the arena of education. She has been an on-call resource person for the past 2 decades, providing technical assistance to requesting communities in developing initiatives related to culture-based education in the context of indigenous peoples, more popularly known in the Philippines as indigenous people's education. So I now turn over the floor to Lurie for her panel. Over to you, Ma'am Lori.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And thank you for this opportunity to share about the journey of indigenous peoples communities in the Philippines, particularly in advocating for indigenous peoples education, and how this advocacy is moving us towards inclusion and even reconciliation. So first off, I will just as a summary of what we will be sharing, we will have a brief profile of the Philippines in terms of indigenous peoples, and then the shift of perspectives in terms of education and indigenous peoples over the decades. Then we will also look into how indigenous peoples education promotes inclusion and how inclusion hopefully, and we are seeing signs of it, will lead towards reconciliation. So just as a quick profile of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines, because of the lack of accurate data until now, this is just a rough estimate. Supposedly, there are 12 to 17% of the total population in the country would be indigenous peoples. And in terms of its distribution, 33% are in Luzon, one of the major islands of the country. 61%, the biggest population would be in the islands of Mindanao, and the smallest population would be in the Visayas. Before I continue, I'd like to check, is it moving? Just in case. Okay,
Yes,
thank you. Thank you. And right now, when we talk of the groups, the indigenous peoples groups in the country, in terms of what is officially communicated, we have what we call 7 ethnographic regions and around 110 different indigenous peoples or indigenous cultural communities in different parts of the country. It might help to have just an overview of how many learners, for example, are in the public school system. So just as a rough way for us to see the relationship of IP learners and what services are available. So we have over 2.5 million IP learners in the public school system. That's around 11% of all public school learners. We have 41, around 41,000 plus schools with IP learners. So that's around 75% of all public schools. Then we have around 1,500 plus schools that are dominantly, that are with 100% IP learners. In other words, all the learners in this 1,500 plus schools are IPs themselves. This would be our data for 2019, school year 2019-2020. So that's for the public schools. We also have indigenous learners in our private schools. So again, for that same year, there are around 252,000 plus indigenous learners in all private schools in the country. And there are around 11,500 plus private schools with IP learners. And there are 142 private schools in the country that are all IP learners. So in most cases, these schools with dominant IP learners or that are purely IP learners, they are so mostly by virtue of circumstances. The schools are located in IP areas or in IP communities, but there are also schools, private schools in particular, who really choose to serve IP learners as a way of serving IP communities. So while it seems that there are quite a number of learners in the public school system, and we can probably surmise that it has been so even in previous decades, the question now would be, what kind of education is being received? Now, I'll just share very briefly major shifts in the way education has been articulated when it comes to indigenous peoples in the country through the decades. So if we go back historically, we will see that the first efforts in education would be education for assimilation, meaning the objective. I'll explain more later. No? So the first would be the education for assimilation, followed by education for indigenous peoples communities, then indigenous peoples education. So to share about each perspective roughly and concisely, the assumption, for example, in education for assimilation is that indigenous peoples communities are not educated and are illiterate. That's the dominant tendency to see communities that way. And therefore, the purpose in education for assimilation is to remove the indigenous culture of the learners, that they should forget it, that they should let go of it, and they learn the cultures and ways of the dominant society. And the process would be to provide uniform education services. What is the kind of education for all Filipinos is the same also for indigenous learners. And then through time, that shifted to what I would roughly call education for IP communities. It still was still built on the assumption that IP communities are not educated and are illiterate, but there is now this element of respect for identity, and this has to do also with the growing advocacy for respect for identity of various peoples. But the assumption, again, is still there about IP communities not being educated and being illiterate. the purpose now, therefore, of the education services would be so that the indigenous peoples would be respected by being educated and successful in the wider society. So in other words, you get your respect, or your respect is in a way earned because you are educated and you are considered successful in the wider society. So some would say so that IPs can level up. So there is that idea that IPs still have something like a lower status that they have, and therefore they have to be educated to have the same status as others. And again, the process would be more or less a uniform, a form of education as the rest, but there is now a touch of cultural elements because of the importance of identity. But we will note the assumptions. No? We will note the assumptions. Then again, through time, there has been a shift to what we now call, or at least what has become popularized to be called indigenous people's education, where the assumption now is that indigenous people's communities have a system of education. And I think that's one major shift that has happened in the past 25 years or so. Therefore, the purpose of indigenous people's education is to forward the respect for indigenous peoples that would include their identity, history, the sense of community of indigenous communities, including self-determination. By sense of community, we would include here the indigenous understanding of community being expansive, not just the human community. That would include creation, that would include the sacred, that would include intergenerational ties. So the purpose now has also shifted, if we will notice. And the process now is what is being called by some groups today here in the country as ancestral domain-based education. And it has many ways, there are many ways of expressing this ancestral domain-based education. So the shifts have been very crucial. And what has contributed to these shifts has been the ongoing assertions of communities themselves. The growth of a legal and policy environment through the decades has been helpful. But of course, what fueled the move towards the shifting of perspectives really has been community assertions. At the international level, we also see the importance of campaigns like Education for All and Millennium Development Goals towards this shift in perspectives. So the understanding of indigenous people's education and its assertion is coming from key reflections of our elders from communities. And I'd like to share two of these reflections. There was a question raised years back where they were saying, should we engage discussions, or should we explore this education system that we have in the wider society? And the reflection of the elders, if we were to summarize it, is something like this, no? They were analogizing this to the bite of the snake, and they were saying that we can look at education as injuring us because the prevailing educational system has hurt us through assimilation. So that's where you are bitten by the snake. But the cure is the venom of the snake itself. And therefore, the idea was we need to engage the education system and in that arena, push for the inclusion of our system. So it's not to reject the system, but to engage this wider arena that is there in the country and advocate for the inclusion of indigenous people's education. The second reflection that came about in the process of advocating for indigenous people's education was to see it as one elder put it, it's like two wings of a bird, where the advocacy for ancestral domains, particularly at this time in history, needs to go hand in hand with the advocacy for indigenous people's education, because even if you have the ancestral domains, if the next generations do not understand how to care for it, then we will not have community well-being and self-determination. So they were saying that community well-being and self-determination need to have both the campaign for the ancestral domains and the advocacy for indigenous people's education. And so these reflections continue to guide IP advocates until today, and more reflections are still coming forward, as I hope to share in the next slides. And they were saying that, what kind of learners do we want? We want learners who are rooted in their culture, in their indigenous knowledge systems and practices, and the ancestral domain. Learners who grow up with a clear sense of identity, are committed to face issues of the community, can assert self-determination, and are conscious of being inheritors of a heritage and an elder of coming generations. So with that sense of the learner in mind, one important step that was very crucial in the IP advocacy was remembering our own education systems and processes, because we cannot dialogue with the wider society unless we are able ourselves to articulate our own education systems and processes. Now, because of the time limit, I'll just speed through the succeeding slides, which have to do with aspects of our education system. So, for example, remembering that in the indigenous way of learning, learning is with and from the ancestral domain, and it is lifelong. There is no such thing as what Elder was putting it, there's no enrollment and no graduation in indigenous people's education in the real sense of, education in IP communities. It is also important to remember that learning by doing and experiencing is very crucial, and this is sometimes passed on through generations. So what is learned generations ago is passed on and becomes so much a part of your system as peoples. Another one is, as shared by some of our community elders, we have to remember our sense of inner and outer senses. They were saying that today's education system is so focused on the 5 senses. We have other senses, we have inner senses. We have our own articulation of educational psychology. We have our own articulation of the curriculum. We also recognize that learning is a community act and it is intergenerational. And also that we have to remember the value of our oral transmission of knowledge in a world that has become so enamored by literacy. I mean, we have so many campaigns about, promoting literacy, but how many campaigns do we have about oracy or orality, no? So
Lori,
even the nature, yes, Apo.
Sorry, yeah, you have 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. The nature of our learning, how we learn, and how the sacred and the secular, what we today call sacred and secular, are actually one for us. Now, there are ways of knowing that are not learned in our present-day schools. And these processes of remembering are so important if we are to articulate our knowledge systems. And of course, if we look at it holistically, we will find out that at the core of all of this is the nurture of the earth and life. So the main articulation now is we indigenous peoples have an education system, but it is just different. Now, the process of going through that, remembering our own education systems and processes, allows us to reconnect with our elders and culture bearers and knowledge holders. It allows us to remember our values, our meanings, our practices, and our governance mechanisms. And also to remember our sacred connection with our people and the ancestral domain. And if we look at this as a process, we can see how indigenous people's education as an advocacy is actually contributing strongly to revitalizing community institutions. And in that sense, it is one contribution to the SDG 16. Now, I'd like again for us to recall how IP education and the campaign for ancestral domains come together in promoting community well-being and self-determination. Now, there's one other aspect, as Ma'am Vicky mentioned earlier, this process has brought about the dialogue between communities and the national government towards policies that are inclusive now of indigenous learning systems. Now, the last point that I'd like to share is about how inclusion is actually moving us towards reconciliation as a nation. And this is the long-term journey. This year is the 500th year of colonization. We are 500 years ago we were colonized this time, and maybe this is the next journey for us. Inclusion as a process requires openness and dialogue. And that openness and dialogue allows us to, allows us to know more about our indigenous communities. And in the process, we recognize historical injustices and existing forms of exclusion. We cannot talk about inclusion without recognizing that. And by recognizing these historical injustices and existing forms of inclusion, we are moved to recognize how we as peoples in the Philippines have been divided as peoples, how we have common injuries and brokenness actually. And therefore, hopefully, IP education is an invitation for all Filipinos towards healing and reconciliation. That is one of the things that we are noticing now as IP education is becoming a growing awareness and campaign to the wider society. That there is that movement towards recognizing common injuries and wounds, and that we together as Filipino peoples, with IP education being in a way a pioneering movement, moving us towards healing and reconciliation. So that is perhaps the journey for the next 500 years, that we can see how an advocacy like Indigenous people's education can actually move us not only towards inclusion, but towards reconciliation as peoples. And hopefully that helps us see how such an advocacy can have a potential to contributing to the realization of SDG 16. Thank you very much again for this opportunity to share to everyone.
Thank you very much, Luri. That has been a very, very rich presentation. I found it very interesting as it presents the major shift. Well, you said that it took a very long time, but still major change in mindset and assumptions on Indigenous people's education. I also find analogizing of the Indigenous people's education with the two wings of a bird very befitting and apt description of Indigenous ways of learning and doing. So I would have maybe it's a question, and I'm not going to ask Luri to answer now, but maybe a question about how or what are the current challenges of the implementation of Indigenous people's education in the Philippines, and how maybe other countries and other organizations can learn from the implementation of the Indigenous people's education in the Philippines towards reconciliation, as has been pointed out. So thank you very much, Luri. So now we move on to our third panel speaker. Our speaker is Olvi Octaviana Tumbelaca. She is a Benwak Dayak woman from the Jengan Danum village in East Kalimantan. So since 2010, she has been actively involved in the Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women's movement. Olvi has also conducted various kinds of research related to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women. So all the stories and experiences that were obtained and listened to were then written into books. So through Pandora's book and Prisma's book, along with other female writers, Olvi tells a story about about the experiences and impacts of extractive industries in Indigenous peoples and how young women cope with various conditions that appear in those situations. So Olvi also focuses on building critical awareness of Indigenous women and young women through feminist popular education, creative strategies, and capacity building to encourage young women to be involved in social movements, as well as ensuring Indigenous women are empowered in each Indigenous community. So she will share to us the impact of oil palm plantation and palm oil monoculture farming in Indonesia. So over to you, Olvi.
Thank you, Helen. I have this presentation, and Pastor Paul will share the screen for me. Is it correct or? Okay. Okay. Salam Nusantara, Tabea, Hotu. Good morning to the panelists, representative from the Indonesia government, friends of indigenous peoples, and all of you. I'm Olvi Tumbalaka. I belong to Dayak Benua. Today I represent my indigenous community, my organization Perempuan Aman, and all of indigenous peoples in Indonesia. I will provide this information regarding the impact of palm oil plantation on indigenous peoples and especially indigenous women. First, I would like to thanks to Vivat International for inviting me to today's event, and it's an honor for me to be here. Actually, I prepare a video because of the limit of the time, so I couldn't show to you. But this video actually tells the story of what happened to my community when the palm oil plantation came and what this community is doing to survive in this situation. Okay, but we just skip the video and I would like to provide this information regarding the condition of palm oil plantation in Indonesia. Okay. Okay. Based on statistic of the Directorate General of Plantation in Indonesia, the total area of palm oil plantation in Indonesia in 2020 is nearly 150,000 square meters. Or you can imagine the size of Illinois, state of the US, or the size of state of Kazakh. Because of this, Indonesia is the country with the largest area of palm oil plantation in the world. Based on data from the United States Department of Agriculture, this situation happened because the government in Indonesia issue policies that support the acceleration of palm oil because the government considered that the palm oil plantation industry has proven to have made this significant contribution to the national economy, bringing in foreign exchange and absorbing labor. Even according to the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs, Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs, Airlangga Hartarto, he said that the palm oil industry has contributed to decrease poverty and creating jobs for around 60 million workers, so that the palm oil industry is a strategic sector that needs to be guarded by all components of society. And according to our government, as the main palm oil producer, which control like 55% of the world market, and this commodity contributes to 3.5% of national economic growth. And we, as the people, the government said that we have to oblige, I don't know what to say this one, oblige to support this industry. All the things that I talk about the policy, about the government, have taken away the rights of indigenous peoples in the process. And the impacts of palm oil plantation, the first impact is the ecological impact of the development and expansion of palm oil plantation is process of conversion of land function, and from that change, the vast landscape of land, causing the damage to the environment. This is result in, okay. This is make the water, the air, the soil become polluted because of this land clearing. Because of this land clearing activity, as you can see in my presentation. This has happened because this has happened because of when they try to open the land, they will burn the land and the forest. They will use agricultural chemicals from such as pesticide, herbicide that are dangerous and very deadly to the plant and the land. That's why this process make, like I said before, make the air, the water, and the soil polluted. As I mentioned before, that our Ministry for Economic Affairs, Erlangga Hartarto, said this, that the palm oil industry has contributed to decrease poverty, and creating jobs for around 60 million workers. But what really happened is palm oil plantation, which are monoculture plantation, is not a biological ecosystem like forest. This change our landscape, our forest, our land, our water, our lakes, our rivers, and limited and reduce the ability and access of us as indigenous people to continue and maintain the nature. And nature has been, all this time, has been the source of our livelihood and food. And like our ministry said before, that 16 million workers have their job because of this plantation. The job that available in this palm oil plantation actually is daily labor. And how can we work as a labor on our land with unreasonable pay? So when the palm oil arrived or came and changed our indigenous territory, we have to buy everything that we usually don't buy. For example, rice, sweet potatoes, and vegetable. And as the source of protein, fish, because of the river has been polluted, the river is, I'm sorry, what I'm trying to say, that the fish is gone. The boar is gone too, and the deer also. Even we have to buy the clean water for our household, because one palm tree, I don't know what to say this, but sucks up until 12 liters water per day. So the springs and the rivers start to dry up. That's why we have to buy some water to our home, to drink, to take a bath, to cook. Another things that happen is conflicts over land and agricultural resources and criminalization. So the let's call the control and of ownership by this industry, by palm oil plantation, cause this inequality, injustice, and loss of rights, our access, our ownership, our distribution of agriculture resources in our territory, in indigenous territory. This resulting in clashes and dispute that cause poverty or even our life. Cases of criminalization against indigenous elders and indigenous people who refuse palm oil plantation are increasing in the past 2 years in here, Kalimantan. This is the example what happened actually when we try to defend our land. So what we do when all this happens? We starting to strengthen our indigenous education by building indigenous schools. This is one example of my community, from my community, the Dayak Lewangan Indigenous School. We believe this, if we do this, the children, the youth will stay connected to their indigenous territories and create these opportunities to think critically about challenges and new threats that we face, that our community face every day. This indigenous school helps prepare our generation, next generation of indigenous elders. And we hope through this indigenous school, the Dayak Lewangan Indigenous School, we are ready to support our elders to protecting indigenous, our rights, our culture, our territories, and willing to explore and propose exciting new ways to advance indigenous knowledge and practice, while we as indigenous youth still following in the footsteps of the ancestor. Okay, this is an example. This one is in Kalimantan Tengah, where the priest and the village official use the land so the investor will not take our land. This is the children from another indigenous school, Dayak Maanyan. They using the land for the food forest, and they think that if we take care of the food, we will take care of the forest. Okay, another way, we also strengthen ourselves as indigenous women by forming a groups in each community and village to ensure that there is an area of indigenous women. So this is like a management area of indigenous women in indigenous territories. This is a way as indigenous women to claim for the existence of indigenous people that stretches throughout our indigenous territories. And this area is so productive because we managing this area, we're using our knowledge, using our experience that is practiced and developed from time to time from our grandparents, our mother, our me and my next generation. This interaction on this indigenous women management area leads us to the regulation of the area in indigenous territories under indigenous women, and we call ourselves, and we call this thing is governance. Okay, before I end my presentation, I have this quote. This actually song lyrics. Me and my friend, indigenous youth and women from Indonesia, create this song, but I don't sing really well, so I will going to read this poem. So yeah, land. This land is ours. Can they sell it? Can they dispose of it? Like the city folks gave away our homes. This forest is ours. The ancestor spirits within. Can they sell it? Can they wash it up? Like the states overlook us, not seeing us as human. Should we be silent, watching indigenous land being grabbed by crooks and our earth is dying? Should we stay put until it's all gone? And in the end, money is useless. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olvi. That was very powerful. And the question that you posed is really critical and crucial, and is for everyone in this session. So thank you also for giving us a human face on the impact of palm oil monoculture farming in Indonesia. Always shared alarming first-hand impacts of monocrop plantation. And we have seen that the impacts go beyond just mere environmental and economic impacts. It does not only hinder enjoyment of basic needs such as water for drinking, food for the table, but it also creates a domino effect, systemic effect to the erosion of traditional knowledge, governance, peace and security of indigenous peoples, and ultimately to more basic and fundamental, which is the right to life of indigenous peoples. So thank you very much, Olvi. Now we're going to move from this very powerful presentation. We're going to move back to the Philippines to our fourth speaker, the last but not the least speaker, Mr. Jason Menaling of the Pulangian community. Jason is an indigenous forester from the Pulangian tribe in northern Mindanao, Philippines. From his traditional knowledge of relating with the land and from his trainings on technical and scientific methods in forest and farm management, Jason is able to facilitate and integrate approach in natural resource management grounded on the vision of their community for sustainable future. So Jason leads the forest, farm, and leadership in the Margins Center of Apu Palamguan Cultural Educational Center. He also makes linkages with other neighboring villages in the Upper Pulangi through his role as culture and forest coordinator for the program in Upper Pulangi, Bukidnon. That's in southern Philippines. So he will be sharing with us the climate action and adaptation initiatives of indigenous peoples. Over to you, Jason. I understand that Jason has a video that we might be sharing in case he has some technical difficulties, but I hope he is able to share in person today. I mean, in person, virtually. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Ma'am Helen. Thank you for these events and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for these invitations. I am Jason Minaling of Pulangian Culture of Bukidnon, Philippines, discussant on climate actions and adaptation initiative by indigenous people. I would like to acknowledge Mercy Pakiwag and Maura Lipanda, who are the community teachers, for helping me put together this message I share with you today. Indigenous education from our elders start by teaching young children and youth how to live in relation to the land. Taking care of the environment is emphasized as part of our responsibilities. As we pursue further education for our children, we start looking at establishing a learning center in our community that taught the twists and responsibilities of our people. Apo Palamguan Cultural Education Center is named after the elders who dreamed that his children would write their story. We are grateful to the Department of Education for supporting indigenous community in strengthening an education grounded in our culture and gaop, or ancestral domain. As a context of learning, today, we are able to reflect on the challenges in our environment on deeper level. We connect with other community in the valley through the tradition of Buntola daw Sayuda, or visiting and sharing information. We now seek to reach communities far beyond by learning English, so that we may share our knowledge and stories together. This gives the youth opportunity to better appreciate our role in taking care of our gaop, or our ancestral domain. This is one of the key lessons we learn as we participate in professional courses. Focus on peace leadership, agroforestry, and education with the Jesuit worldwide learning. In these courses, we also value accompanying our neighboring communities by creating meaningful linkages and relations. This effort motivates us to stand up for our ancestral domain because our land is our life and livelihood. As we continue to see a great change in society, we also feel its adverse impact on our land and culture. We've seen many communities suffer from the impact of mining in Northeast Mindanao and the threats to the south. The biggest structure in our area are yellow corn corporate growers and their network of traders and financiers that undercut us and leave us with all the risks. Big companies only look at what they can take from us. They don't think about accompanying us in sustaining the living world where we are codependent. They have a very narrow view of life that disregards the welfare of the next generation. Since 1970 to 1980s, our elders struggled because their voice were not heard and their rights were not upheld, as they did not have the prescribed so-called education needed to manage the natural resources. But what they have is a cultural knowledge to live in balance with the life of the land. Our elders entrust us with responsibility to protect our gaop. We, the youth, are slowly equipping ourselves with skills and capacity to fulfill this important role. But because of big companies, indigenous people are made to struggle to prove that we can protect and stand up for our land. This expansive commercial system of farming only look at what could be gained financially. Planting of corn to feed animals and not for a daily consumption of people. We have no faith of corporate agriculture today. There is no justice in the system. It is hard to talk of reconciliation over the past wrong when we see our communities being manipulated and divided by outside interests. We need to strengthen our solidarity as community so that we will not be completely run over by corporate giants and traders. The security of our land, natural resources, food, and water are at stake. The indigenous variety of our seeds are declining in quantity in favor of more widely used commercial seeds. Crops are sprayed with glyphosate, which poses serious health hazard for both the environment and farmers. We need to highlight this as a major concern because these issues also affect biodiversity and our future depends on sustaining this biodiversity. In September, the UN Food System Summit will take place. This needs to be a platform that allows voice from the field to lead the discussions on the balance of ecology and economy as we strive towards food quality, security, and nutrition. It is now difficult for us to predict the planting cycle and plan our farming activities accordingly. We experience a lot of crop damage and loss. Pests, infestation, and drought have been devastating. We are losing the stability our food source. We also experienced Typhoon Pablo in 2012 when we had no one rely on in terms of response and recovery except each others. No one was affected severely. We know not to live by the river or on over steep slopes that are prone of landslide. We could harvest with potato the next day when all the rice and corn were flattened. We realized that the sense of togetherness as a community is most critical in times of disaster. This same solidarity is what sustaining our forests. We know that the forests play a great role in maintaining a stable climate, not to mention a microclimate it creates for local ecosystem. We know the water we drink comes from the forest and fed by the oceans. We know the youth learn skills in pagdumala sa lubas, the kagulangan, assisting natural regeneration for ecosystem restoration that comes from the knowledge of old Sweden follows practices of 10 to 20 years. They learn this inside the classroom and the forest as they are guided by the wisdom of our elders. The youth not only take lead in managing the natural resources, but also in dialogue with different stakeholders to affirm our vision for our community. We support a global action for climate justice. We express the critical role of indigenous cultures in addressing the climate crisis and how youth are at the forefront of the leadership in the forest protection. When it comes to human rights, we are grateful that we've been granted legal rights to manage our ancestral land. But beneath this, there is still a prevailing system where those in position of power still have the final say in terms of how we live our life in our land. If we speak of protecting our lands, indigenous people anywhere in the world have their own way of managing their resources in ways that are not damaging to the different lives that are present in the area. But government also has a policies for managing land that often contradict the right of indigenous people. This undermines our voice because yes, you give us the right in paper, but we don't feel empowered in terms of decision making. We can hold the certificate of ancestral domain title, but after that, now comes the question of government controlled protected areas. Look at how this unjustly done and how institutions beyond us still hold the control. We could be left with nothing but a piece of paper. Our way forward is through Pulang. As Pulangian people, we identify with the Pulangi River, but our identity is also rooted in how we value peace. Pulang means to stay awake. We sit down with the tribal leader and listen to all parties, staying awake until we resolve the conflict, until we have a reconciliation. The practice of Pulang is also represent the covenant of peace our ancestors made generation ago in hope that all tribes live along Pulangi River will work together to ensure that the river will remain source of all life. Pulang remains as our guiding principle as we dialogue about land use practices across Upper Pulangi, and in welcoming youth from different communities to our cultural school. This is how we honor the covenant of peace to the present day. There are no threats or domination in the process. In our culture, buntola daw sayuda allow us visit our neighbor in peace and share what we can. Sometimes it's to dialogue or to build homes together for a family And now we are regenerating our relations with the land, forest, and water. This is our sense of being together. I want to echo this message of being together, especially in this time of immobility and distance. I hope that as a global society, global village, you listen to the concerns and contributions of indigenous peoples. Affirm that intervention need to start by listening to indigenous people and local communities around the world. If this is not done, further problem will be created because top-down projects and policies rarely fit in the local context and needs, and there's no guarantee that these kinds of responses will be sustained. In the upcoming COP26 meeting, we hope to see a greater integration of indigenous peoples' contributions because these are the need service solutions we need to see in rollback of Paris Agreement complete so there is inclusion and action. Support us in upholding our rights to care for the land. We are your best collaborator in safeguarding the future of our planet and ensuring there is equity in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was very articulate and very well said. I'm not going to add to what Jason has already said, but I just wanted to probably sum up that indigenous peoples are among the most vulnerable to climate impacts. And when we say climate impacts, we don't only mean typhoons and droughts, but also other climate actions or actions that are supposed to contribute to climate mitigation. But then, as Jason has shared in his presentation, we have to stop regarding indigenous peoples as mere victims to these disasters or to this crisis, because he shared very rich stories of resilience, of how indigenous peoples are adapting, of how indigenous peoples are sharing, how they're staying awake, having discussions and dialogues, which ultimately contribute to reconciliation. So thank you very much again, Jason, and thank you so much to all our speakers. So we time check. We have more or less 11 minutes before our end time. So I have seen that there are some questions in the chat box. I'm going to try and read them to our speakers. So there are, I receive at least three questions for Luri. This is about the indigenous people's education. One is that it's very specific, that many indigenous people schools were established in Mindanao, like the Lumad Bakwit School, through the efforts of the indigenous people's communities and leaders and parents. But the president has ordered to close them. Some were highly militarized. Indigenous peoples were threatened, harassed, and even killed. What are your thoughts on this, and what support does the national IP education give for indigenous peoples communities, students, and teachers affected by this? That's one question, but maybe because I'm going to give Lori some time to respond to this, if you are going to allow me to read one more question for you so that you can answer to them when I give you the floor. So how do we reconcile the newly educated indigenous people's aspirational goals, which are so much in line with the mainstream ideas of development, and the emerging idea of indigenous people's education? So this question is from Thomas Palitanan. Yeah. So can I give Lori 2 minutes to to respond to these questions. And there's another one, is that what are the current challenges in the indigenous people's education implementation in the country? So can I have you, please, Luri? 2 minutes.
Okay, that's 3 questions in 2 minutes. So I'm thinking of framing this again from a historical perspective, no, and again linking it to what we are trying to focus on in terms of SDG 16. The question of the challenges, the one about reconciling the views of the young, the educated, quote unquote, the educated IPs, and they have different views, and then this IP ed, and then the situation of IP communities in conflict areas, or if I may expand the context, communities where we see the in a way the clash of perspectives. That's what's happening. No? So we see that tension of different perspectives in different forms, and the gift, I think, of IP communities is that intergenerational capacity for patient dialogue, if I may put it that way. Because when I look at our elders and I see their faces and I see the depth of how they can continue despite all these tensions, I can only describe it that way. It is really an intergenerational historical patience for dialogue that is capable of forgiving and capable of embracing the tension. And that, I think, is something that I hope the wider society learns to respect, because that kind of capacity to forgive and to embrace is something that goes beyond generations even. So that gift of communities, I hope, is something that that we learn to recognize, and that can be that capacity of our elders is something that can carry us through these different types of tensions. On the individual level, when we talk of these educated IPs and this push for IP education, the advocacy for IP education, the forgiveness is both individual and at the same time with the persons or maybe the immediate groups of people that you have injured, especially if educated IPs impose their views on the community, for example, and then you realize that that was not the appropriate way of doing things. And then the more institutional challenges that has been encountered again historically, whether it is church groups, NGOs, government, again, the capacity for dialogue is inviting us. And in the case of indigenous people's education, there was a blessed moment, if I may call it, a blessed moment of dialogue possible. And hopefully we can learn from that allows us to still move forward despite these tensions. So I personally am hopeful that if we are able to remember that kind of capacity for forgiveness and for embracing tensions, which is not only among indigenous peoples, actually. It's very much rooted in communities that have a sense of history, that have a sense of intergenerational ties. It's possible to see new ways forward. So I know I'm speaking in a very, some may say hypothetical, but I have seen it in action and it's possible. So from a perspective of an advocate and speaking to support groups, I hope we can recognize that gift of indigenous peoples, because that is one gift I think that will see us through these tensions, especially now with climate change, especially now with the kind of difficulties we're facing. We will need a lot of forgiveness and embracing of tensions at this time, leading to new ways of living and doing things. So, and that embracing and forgiving will come in different forms, but it is crucial for all of us to hopefully learn from this gift of indigenous communities. I'll end because it's 2 minutes. I think I even can be at 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luri. I'm sure there's so much still to learn from each other. It's just that we are really limited with time. So I'm going to read two more questions. And this is for Jason. Jason, how can we reconcile the gap between the government policies and the indigenous people's rights? And also, how can we address the lack of participation in decision making? Jason?
Thank you for the good questions. For me, as indigenous people here in Mindanao, because there are times that the voice of indigenous people are not really heard by government, in especially in for the rights, because for now, in our country, I have paper, I have a country title, um, but my yung ano ko amay ba yung parang parang yung right,
Dili pwede mag-decision. You can't make the decision over.
But they don't have a decision, for example, the protected areas. So parang
Government makes the decision.
because the government is parang they are
Different program.
sila yung
You can speak in,
sila
you
yung
can, yeah, in
Okay.
Tagalog. I can help
Tagalog.
translate. Yeah.
Kasi parang meron kaming title pero parang sa akin parang nalilito ako as indigenous people kasi parang binigay sa amin yung right na makahawak kami ng paper ng title na sa country namin, pero parang hindi pa rin na ano yung right namin as kami yung nagmamanage dito kasi una is talagang bakit pa mayroong protected areas kung kami ay marunong naman kaming mag-protect sa aming area kasi kami yung mga indigenous people na andito sa aming gaop, aming ancestral domain. So parang ganyan ba?
Thank you, Jason. Yeah. So Jason was saying that it's difficult for him to. He feels confused because while the government has given them the title, the certificate of ancestral domain title to their land, this is not in paper, but it's not manifested in the real actual management of their ancestral domain, because while on the one hand, there is the certificate of ancestral domain for indigenous peoples, there's also the establishment of protected areas by the government on the other hand. So this sorts of confuses indigenous peoples, and he was also saying that to be able to really resolve this problem is that for the government to provide seat for indigenous peoples in the decision-making policy spaces in the country. So thank you, Jason. Okay, I see that it's already 10 p.m. my time. I hope it's still okay for people to stay for just a few minutes, just for us to really wrap up and close the session. But please allow me to thank all the panel speakers. Unfortunately, while this has been a very rich exchange, we have a very, very tight time. So thank you so much for our speakers. So session has shown that it's really difficult for us to hope for sustainable development without the realization of the rights of everyone, including of indigenous peoples. And we have seen how indigenous children still lag in terms of accessible and culturally appropriate education in many, not just in the Philippines, but in many other countries in the world, and that indigenous peoples' lands and territories and resources still continue to be ravaged by many extractive industries, and that indigenous peoples still do not have seat, do not have a say in decision-making processes, and that there are certain key asks, there are certain key recommendations in terms of going forward, including, for example, the inclusion of youth and women in the call for climate justice, for the support of indigenous peoples' education systems, and for indigenous peoples to keep staying awake and doing the intergenerational capacity for patient dialogue, as Luri puts it. And also, there's a call for the global society and the global village to listen to the voice of indigenous peoples. I'm not going to repeat what has already been said by our speakers, and I want to call on Vicky maybe for 2 minute last words before we finally close the session.
Okay.
Vicky.
Thank you very much, Helen. And I really thank the panelists that what you have shared with us are very crucial and for us to understand better the needs of indigenous peoples as well as the contributions that they are making. And I think I would like uh, to end this session by again raising the banner of indigenous peoples in terms of the contributions that they are doing. And as Jason has said, we are the ones who know how to manage and sustainably use our territories. So we are asking the governments not to impose systems that are going to weaken these systems that have indeed contributed to some of the solutions to the problems we are facing. And I also appreciate very much the contributions of Lori and our and Olvi. I think the points and the issues that you raise in relation to the threats are very real. And I end up with again the call that since this is a side event of the permanent forum during the permanent forum on indigenous issues, for our organizers to help put together some of their key the key takeaways that they see from this and present this to the permanent forum as some of the conclusions and recommendations that they will have when the sessions are over, because this will enrich the discussion of the theme that's peace, justice, and strong institutions, and to say that indigenous institutions are still alive, they are still there, people are still working using these institutions, and they're trying to transmit it to the younger generations. So the least that we need is the support from the international community as well as from national governments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And before we go, may I call on Sister Mari de Santos from the Marinol Sisters for her closing remarks.
Thank you, Helen. Just a correction, I'm a Holy Spirit sister.
Sorry.
Okay. So indeed, we just had a very rich discussion that has made us aware of and understand some very important and challenging issues that our IP brothers and sisters are facing, particularly on education, climate change, and extractive industries in Indonesia and the Philippines. In behalf of Vivat International, the Marinol Sisters of St. Dominic, and the NGO Mining Working Group, I wish to thank all our speakers, Vicky, Olvi, Lori, and Jason, who have generously shared from the wealth of their experience and knowledge on indigenous issues. Thank you to Helen, our good moderator. Also to our co-sponsors, Eco Jesuit and Tebteba, to Marvi Misolas and Paul Ramat, who have been with me in the organizing team, and to all of you who have participated in our side event. We continue to follow the 20th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Good rest of the day or good night, depending on where you are. God bless everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye. Thank you
Be
very much.
safe. Keep safe.
Yeah.